Thank you, and welcome to all of you. We're so glad that you could be here this evening. As we've already mentioned, if we need to preempt tonight with an address from the President, we will. We were talking at dinner about how we were hoping this would be a timely debate and a very timely subject. We had no idea how exactly timely tonight's debate would be. What I wanted to do, though, before I introduce our speakers, is just tell you a little bit about what we're hoping to do with this evening. As we all know, as we assemble here, we are acutely aware of the fact that we are on the verge of war with Iraq. Tonight's debate will not be addressing the specifics of the Iraq situation, because we have a slightly different view that we'd like to get across. That is, our goal is to examine specifically the policy of preemption, which is one of several issues that are at stake in the Iraqi conflict. And I think perhaps more importantly for tonight, it's a policy that is now an officially recognized doctrine of U.S. foreign policy. So as we think about it in the situation with Iraq, we should also be thinking about preemption as a larger strategy of U.S. foreign policy. So we will be focusing on the question, is preemptive warfare morally advisable? Drawing upon both just war theory and our understanding of our call as Christians, our speakers tonight will offer opposing views on the ethical desirability of this idea of preemption. As you will see in your programs, the debate will begin with constructive speeches, followed by a period of cross-examination and rebuttals. And our time this evening will conclude with questions and answers from a panel of Wheaton students gathered here who've been active on the campus on this issue. We will end promptly at 9 o'clock, we promise, and we hope that you'll be able to stay for the entire program this evening. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Michael Cartwright is the Dean of the Ecumenical and Interfaith Program and serves as the Executive Director of the Crossing Project at the University of Indianapolis, where he also serves as an Associate Professor of Philosophy and Religion. An ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, Dr. Cartwright frequently teaches continuing education courses for both clergy and laity. He co-edited the Hauerwas Reader and edited The Royal Priesthood, Essays Ecclesiological and Ecumenical by John Howard Yoder. Keith Pavlicek is a fellow at the Center for Public Justice and director of the Civitas Program in Faith and Public Affairs. A veteran of the Gulf War, he is a colonel in the Marine Corps Reserves and was recalled to active duty last May. Dr. Pavlicek holds master's degrees from the Institute for Christian Studies and Westminster Theological Seminary, and he received his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh in Religion, Ethics, and Society. He is the author of John Courtney Murray and the Dilemma of Religious Toleration. We will begin our evening's debate with a constructive speech by Dr. Pavlicek.
Don't start that clock. We're under a strict clock. I just want to make a quick remark before I blitz into my opening comments. You can do this too. This is not cheating. I want to just apologize for being in a less formal attire than I would have liked. I just got off the airplane at just short of 7 o'clock. I was planning on being here a little earlier, but the flight was significantly delayed, and so I came right here. And secondly, I want to thank Amy Black. One part of her biography that she mentioned, she was a Crossroads Scholar, which is a program that I run. It was a Pew-funded program, and I told her before this started that she should not show impartiality, but she should show partiality, lest I tell some stories out of line. And I understand there's been a recent change, official change to Wheaton College that you probably are pretty happy about. Is that true? Oh, that is playing dirty. Okay, you can start the clock. Start the clock now. We must be prepared to stop rogue states and their terrorist clients before they are able to threaten or use weapons of mass destruction against the United States and our allies and friends. New deadly challenges have emerged from rogue states and terrorists. The nature and motivations of these new adversaries, their determination to obtain destructive powers, hitherto available only to the world's strongest states, and the greater likelihood that they will use weapons of mass destruction against us make today's security environment more complex and dangerous than even during the Cold War. It has taken almost a decade for us to comprehend the true nature of this new threat. Given the goals of rogue states and terrorists, the United States can no longer solely rely on a reactive posture as we have in the past. The inability to deter a potential attacker, the immediacy of today's threats, and the magnitude of potential harm that could be caused by our adversaries' choice of weapons do not permit that option. We cannot let our enemies strike first. Why? First, in the Cold War, weapons of mass destruction were considered weapons of last resort, whose use risked the destruction of those who use them. Today, our enemies see weapons of mass destruction as weapons of choice. Second, traditional concepts of deterrence will not work against a terrorist enemy whose avowed tactics are wanton destruction and the targeting of innocents, whose so-called soldiers seek martyrdom in death, and whose most potent protection is statelessness. The overlap between states that sponsor terror and those that pursue weapons of mass destruction compels us to action. For centuries, international law recognized that nations need not suffer an attack before they can lawfully take action to defend themselves against forces that present an imminent danger of attack. Legal scholars and international jurists often condition the legitimacy of preemption on the existence of an imminent threat. Most often, a visible mobilization of armies, navies, and air forces preparing to attack. We must adapt the concept of imminent threat to the capabilities and objectives of today's adversaries. To forestall or prevent such hostile acts by our adversaries, the United States will, if necessary, act preemptively. The United States will not use force in all cases to preempt emerging threats, nor should nations use preemption as a pretext for aggression. Yet in an age where the enemies of civilization openly and actively seek the world's most destructive technologies, the United States cannot remain idle while dangers gather. I've taken up 3.5 minutes of my 12 minutes to read verbatim from the National Security Strategy of the United States, which is what Amy said is official doctrine. The question before us today is whether I just read a statement that has caused near hysteria among some people is in fact hysterical, or whether it can be justified in terms of classic Christian thinking about statecraft, the use of force, political responsibility, in short, the just war tradition. That is, more specifically, whether the notion that Christians have always endorsed in the just war tradition of being able to respond to an imminent threat can be expanded in the way the National Security Strategy suggests against the terrorist threat, the asymmetrical terrorist threat. I think clearly it can. And the portal to discuss this, I think, is best approached by asking what the Christian moral judgment classically has been against terrorism. Now, most people tend to think that the answer to that question is obvious, that Christianity condemns terrorists because, unlike disciplined soldiers on the battlefield, they directly and intentionally target non-combatants. And that's true enough. But to understand the evil of terrorism exclusively through the prism of non-combatant immunity is to make a dangerous moral and political concession. Here we must turn to the jus ad bellum criteria of right authority. In recent years, the criterion of legitimate authority has almost entirely been neglected by theologians advancing claims in the just war tradition. At least among American theologians and philosophers, discussions have centered on peripheral questions as to whether the president can use force without the consent of Congress, whether the War Powers Act is unconstitutional, et cetera, and whether UN approval is needed, which it isn't, by the way. Classically, it's not required, and I'll get to that in a second. While these may be important questions, they fail to address the most fundamental issue and obscure the full moral significance of the fight against terrorism. In asking whether war could be waged justly, Thomas Aquinas began not with just cause, but with legitimate authority, citing his biblical support, Romans 13, 1-6. By legitimate authority, Aquinas, and he's just summarizing the Christian tradition here, Christian thought more generally, was referring to a political authority to which there was no superior. Beginning with St. Augustine and developing throughout the Middle Ages, Christian thinkers sought to curb violence by declaring illegitimate any use of force by subordinate nobles, private soldiers, criminals, and the church. For example, when confronted with a militaristic Germanic culture in which princes frequently engaged and glorified in combat for private ends, Christian thinkers repeatedly insisted that warfare was a public issue. War could not merely be an extreme tool of private parties, but had to be a legal instrument, a part of the coercive power of the law itself. Historically and theoretically, securing a public monopoly on the use of force was a necessary, though not sufficient, precondition for a peaceful and civilized society. From this just war perspective, the freelance terrorism of our time is nothing less than a direct assault on this achievement of Christian civilization. Failure for the United States to act decisively and preemptively, if necessary, against terrorism in a publicly authorized way will encourage the proliferation of disorder and barbarism of a kind far worse than the private wars of the so-called Dark Ages. If left unchallenged, the rise of terrorism may foreshadow a return to the barbarism of private war. In fact, a return to private warfare in the 20th century is far more ominous, since vengeance is no longer fueled merely by distorted notions of private glory and honor. Today, the motive is ideological, ethnic, and a religious fanaticism that knows no bounds, and is now equipped with technologies capable of inflicting truly inhuman carnage. But again, it is not the potential, just the potential destructiveness of modern terrorism, which raises heightened moral concern and new and improved thinking about what constitutes an imminent threat. Rather, terrorism and the rogue nations that support it, by its nature, aims to undermine the goods of justice, order, and peace, which are secured by political authority. When Thomas Aquinas was asked whether war is always sinful, his answer was, of course not. He said 3 criteria required: just cause, right intention, legitimate authority. Each of them significantly is pegged to a political good. Just cause is pegged to the political good of justice, right intention to the end of peace, or a peace of order among nations. And legitimate authority is pegged to the good of order. In attacking these political goods, terrorism attacks every human being who benefits from them. In short, terrorism comes about as close as is possible to what the old moral theologians called malum se, evil in itself. Thus, we should have no qualms when our political leaders refer to terrorists and regimes that support them as evildoers. Far from being irrelevant to the war on terrorism, the classic just war tradition developed in large measure precisely to confront and contain the sort of private violence or private war currently practiced by terrorist organizations of all sorts. Now, I've concentrated almost entirely up to this point. I've got a couple minutes left on legitimate authority because I think that's the key to understanding the evil of terrorism. The classic understanding of just cause included 3 criteria: defense against attack, retaking something wrongfully taken, and punishment of evil. Right out of the Summa, right out of Thomas Aquinas. It was not restricted to defense. Now, in international law, after the Peace of Westphalia, for reasons that I don't have the time to discuss, but which those of you who are historians should be obvious. In international law, the classical just war understanding of just cause was constricted to defense alone. Over the past decade, there's been significant rethinking among just war thinkers, primarily because they wanted to open up the possibility of humanitarian intervention, forceful humanitarian intervention, in case of particularly egregious human rights, genocide, okay? And it became very clear that you could not do that. You could not intervene in a Rwanda or a Kosovo if defense was the only just cause. If defense was only a just cause, intervention to prevent genocide in Rwanda, Bosnia, Kosovo was immoral and illegal. And I don't think that's right. Well, I'm going to end there. Am I out of time? 1 minute? Well, that's pretty good. The bottom line here is that the new situation is, in a sense, a back to the future. That the just war tradition developed, particularly, prior to its articulation in the Summa by Thomas, precisely to address the questions of private warfare. And there was always in that tradition the understanding that if attack was imminent, you could preempt the attack. In fact, I want to suggest something even stronger, that the very understanding of last resort only makes sense if you're considering a preemptive attack against an imminent threat. The notion of last resort doesn't come into play if you or your allies have already been attacked, because the civil authorities are under the obligation to protect their innocent from that harm. Hopefully we'll be able to discuss this more fully in the question and answer. Thank you.
If I were a political scientist, I might engage this whole debate definitionally, because political scientists like my colleague Bill Ayers at the University of Indianapolis would contest the very notion of preemptive war as a category mistake. I'm not a political scientist. I won't go down that road. As I was walking across the way to this gathering tonight, I was reminded of the last time I was here for the conference on theology of race and reconciliation in 1997. It was a very moving conference for me, and it occurred to me to wonder what it would be like if Eugene Rivers were standing here instead of myself. It would be a different kind of debate, but I'd like to think that maybe I will raise some of the issues that Eugene Rivers would raise. Maybe, maybe not. Although I advocate a Christian pacifist stance in this conflict, I would very much encourage those Christians whose convictions have been informed by the just war tradition to engage in critical reflection about those criteria. The sheet that was handed out gives you the classic conspectus of the 9 criteria. As Keith has indicated, the distinction between jus ad bellum, jus in bello, is important. And it's also the case that this conspectus is the product of centuries of thinking. I think it is very important for Christians to try to come to grips with what is the status of the moral authority of this tradition for Christian reasoning. It makes a difference in a lot of ways. And it makes a difference in how we enumerate them. Keith indicated 3 in particular that are important. Others would disagree. My concern is not to disagree with that in particular, but to remind you in a bit of an overview that classically speaking, there are 4 Christian attitudes to war and peace. 2 of those presume that the burden of proof is upon those who would go to war. That's just war and the various Christian pacifisms. Blank check is when the people of a given nation state give over to the person that they regard to have a legitimate authority the role of doing further moral deliberation. In other words, for blank check, there's only the question of whether George is legitimate or not. Holy war, or the crusade, is a form of transcendent validation, believing that God has called us to do it. All four of these have been in evidence in Christian history in various ways, at various times, and they have been expressed with various adequacy. Too often, what has happened, I believe, is that Christians have tended to stop their reflection with the question of whether the authority is legitimately constituted. It is an important question. It is not the only question. When we leave it to the president, or when we leave it to the just war thinkers to do our moral discernment for us, we are abdicating our moral responsibility as persons who have been called to be ambassadors for Christ in the world. I stand before you as someone who was raised in a Southern Baptist church and taught to be an RA, a Royal Ambassador for Christ. And that is an identity we all should wear, male and female. To be about the task of reconciliation in the world is to be about God's business in the world. And how we would justify that with preemptive war is a very important thing to think about, theologically, practically, prudentially. My concern tonight, then, is twofold. I want to clarify the kind of evangelical moral imagination that Christians are called to exercise. And I want to clarify the kind of practical wisdom that we must exercise as moral agents who live in a nation state that boasts of freedom and democracy while unconsciously drifting into the habits of an empire that is launching a war that has all the marks of crusade. The first concern has everything to do with the kind of moral discernment we seek. The second matter requires that we look carefully at the effects, not just the intentions, but the effects of statements and actions without taking refuge in sentimental ascriptions of intent. One of the curious things about the cases being made for the recently advocated notion of preemptive war is that they have so little to do with what might be called the imagination of the evangelical Christian witness, and much more to do with the imagination of revenge that informs much popular culture, TV, and movies. Now, let me hasten to add here, I'm not saying that Keith Pavlicek has this notion, but there is an imagination of revenge that is tied up with the thinking about preemptive war, and we would delude ourselves if we did not engage it. This is what happens, I believe, when Christians allow their imaginations to be more or less captivated by the power of evil. Evil can shape our imaginations. Our attraction to and our repulsion from evil can distract us and help us to forget that our ethic is a cruciform ethic. I submit that it is a failure of the evangelical Christian imagination to believe that the only alternatives that are before us are, quote, to drift along toward tragedy or set a course toward safety, as President Bush argued. This kind of binary thinking, 0 or 1 thinking, hardly does justice to the multidimensional wisdom of the just war tradition, not to mention the imaginative witness of Christian pacifism. As is often the case, I think we need to rethink the supposed rightness of the questions that authorize such moral perspectives. In one of his occasional essays, John Howard Yoder offered important clarification about what Christian moral discernment is about. I quote, "Moral discernment asks not how to be blameless, but how to represent in the world the servanthood of Jesus Christ. In a fallen world, that weakness will always include the inability to prevent some evils happening. And in Reinhold Niebuhr's terms, that means participation in guilt. So be it in those terms. The sin of not being able to prevent crucifixion is preferable to the sin of killing. Yet, the avoidance of sin is the least nuanced way to say it, end quote. Christian moral discernment is about how we understand ourselves to be ambassadors for Jesus Christ in the world, and how the prudential judgments that we make comport with that vocation. As George Lopez of the University of Notre Dame and other advocates of just war theory have recently pointed out, one of the unfortunate outcomes of 9/11 has been the re-emergence of what might be best called Dirty Harry ethics. Now, for those of you who've never had the pleasure of watching the Dirty Harry movie, don't bother. But it's about a renegade cop who engages in morally dubious acts in an effort to deal with dirty cops. And he does so in an atmosphere in which moral clarity is utterly transparent to him. The logic of Dirty Harry ethics goes like this: bad guys will come back to bite you badly. They don't play by any existing rules, and we should not be so constrained. In taking action, our allies may not support us, which is all right with us on balance, because, after all, at the end of our actions, everyone will thank us. For many American citizens, Dirty Harry ethics has become a kind of surrogate for justifying war, instead of the more careful casuistry associated with the just war tradition. I honor those who do the hard work of thinking through the just war criteria. Dirty Harry ethics does not require casuistry. The moral clarity assumed by Dirty Harry ethics does not require us to do the careful prudential calculation that the just war tradition has been understood to require. And let me be clear, I do not think that all Christians in the United States of America have bought into Dirty Harry ethics. And obviously, I think that the question of preemptive war is all messed up with Dirty Harry ethics, because Dirty Harry is going to do it before it gets done too. The Roman Catholic community in the United States in particular has been very careful and very effective in raising questions derived from the just war criteria about this distortion of preemptive war. Number one, Roman Catholics have argued that preventive war is not a just cause, especially if there is no imminent threat. Classically, preemptive war involves imminent threat. Last resort is a particular challenge in this case. Legitimate authority might be based on an international consensus to go to war, as shown in the Security Council resolution, but not exclusively so. The new emphasis on the great good that will result from a U.S.-led war is remarkably late and may be disingenuous. Some real fears and concerns about proportionality and discrimination do need to be addressed. I find it ironic that given this kind of distorted thinking that confuses people to think that the just war theory is Dirty Harry ethics, and vice versa, I find it rather ironic that some advocates of the just war theory are trying to shut down conversations about the justifiability of war in Christian congregations and denominations on the grounds that lay people do not have the competence to make such determinations. This is disturbing for at least two reasons. Number one, it attempts to silence one of the prophetic voices that would disentangle Dirty Harry ethics from just war reasoning. You're not going to look to the federal government to give you a takedown of Dirty Harry ethics. It's not in their interest to do so. You're not going to find military planners doing a takedown of the argument. It is going to have to come from external critique. Secondly, it has the effect, when you say that only those who are competent to judge can be part of the conversation, it has the effect of suggesting that the blank check conception of justifiability of war has merit after all. By wanting to restrict the conversation to 3 criteria, legitimate authority, just cause, and last resort, without dealing with challenges posed by the question of likelihood of success, the conversation is restricted to those who know, leaving aside those who are declared not to know. But here is a very important question. What is the likelihood of success? What is the likelihood of success? How would we know when we've been successful? Is that a short-term calculation? Is that a long-term calculation? It's a prudential matter when you talk about preemptive war to raise the question, do we know what the likelihood of success is? Thank you.
All right, we will now turn to a time of questions and answers, and we will be going back and forth between our 2 speakers. We'll begin with Dr. Pavlicek asking a question to Dr. Cartwright, and then go back and forth from there. So.
The national security strategy of the United States was signed by an evangelical Christian, George Bush. One of the most prominent, she didn't write it entirely herself, but it was Condoleezza Rice, who was another very solid evangelical believer. Are you accusing them of advancing an immoral, dirty, hairy ethics, brother and sisters in the Lord?
I'm a United Methodist. I have to say that while I think it appropriate to respect the president, at the level at which I would regard him as United Methodist, I would have to question the effectiveness of United Methodist catechesis and the effectiveness of teaching him about matters of war. I think it's appropriate to raise that kind of question. I would not question the intent of the president or Condoleezza Rice. I would question the effects of the strategies, and I would question the ways in which those strategies happen to serve the interest of things that are not wholly benign. And I think that's appropriate. The agenda of the Project for the New American Century is a crusade against Islam. It is an effort to reset the Middle East under American control. That is a publicly stated attempt, publicly stated desire of the Project for the New American Century. And the persons who are part of that are in the Bush government. So I think you can question these things in terms of the other kinds of participations and the other kinds of involvements. I don't think we have to show disrespect to the president, but I also don't think we should sentimentalize it by saying that because they are Christians and we are Christians, that we should simply trust. I guess I would want to inquire, Keith, whether your understanding of competence would provide for competence of discussing the just war theory, would provide for means of critiquing dirty, hairy ethics. Because I wouldn't presume that you would challenge that there are those in our culture today who think that way, whether or not people in the administration think that way.
Well, the final caveat is really crucial. I mean, because the answer you just gave me was much more moderate than the accusation. You're saying, I mean, let's just put our cards on the table, if we can use a term that's been thrown around lately here. You're claiming that the President of the United States, a fellow United Methodist, is pursuing an evil dirty, hairy policy. Now you can say that's not his intent. But see, I happen to know that he has had a number of counselors who, from the evangelical community, not all singing off the same page, discuss questions of just war. And as well as the Secretary of Defense and Condoleezza Rice are very much tutored in this. The question about competency. I think the position of myself, and not just me, Paul Ramsey, a good United Methodist, and James Turner Johnson and George Weigel, and a number of other of us who are trying to revive classic just war thought. We're not saying that the laity is incompetent. Generally, our critique is against clericalism. Our claim is that clerics, or bureaucrats with collars, which I think you and
I resemble
Stanley
that
Howard,
remark.
you do, except you don't have a collar. Or you know, the people sitting up in the God box in Washington have any special competence. And let me put it. Let me answer as frankly as I can about the incompetence of the Roman Catholic clergy on this issue. Now, I have a great deal of respect for John Paul II, but I think on this he's been absolutely terrible. And the American Catholic bishops have been absolutely terrible. Their competence doesn't even extend, right, to protecting their own congregations, their own parishioners from predatory priests. And then they stand up and say, providing advice on prudential matters of policy on how to best protect American citizens from the horrors of terrorists using weapons of mass destruction. I'm saying that their incompetence does not extend to issues of what is reasonable chance of success. Because the classic tradition, when Thomas listed those three criteria, yes, of intention, right authority, just cause. The other criteria are important, but they're prudential calculations to be determined, not mathematically, by those who know what they're talking about. And in almost every instance, it's not the bureaucrats with collars. It's not that the laity, George Bush is Christian laity. Condi Rice is laity. I'm laity, right? The military commanders in the field who have to make those hard, on-the-spot decisions, they are laity, right? That's where the competence lies. So I've never said, and we've never said, that laity is incompetent. What we're saying is we're combating clericalism. That just simply because somebody has a theological degree makes them competent in this area.
I'd like to know what difference, if any, you think it makes how the United States action in a preemptive war is perceived by Muslims around the world.
Well, it matters, and
How did it matter?
Well, I think it's going to be to our great advantage when we have people celebrating their liberation in Iraq, for instance. Certainly, Shias in the South. Certainly, Sunnis who've been oppressed. We saw it until the first George Bush basically turned away from his promise. The Shias celebrated after the conclusion of the first Gulf War. So it's important, yes, absolutely. Now, I guess what you're really getting at is the question that keeps popping up is to whether this will further radicalize the so-called Arab street. I'm not so sure. It's certainly a factor that one certainly has to consider. And I would say that that's certainly a prudential judgment one has to weigh. But I would say that one has to distinguish, first of all, between preemptively attacking terrorists who have no rights, right? Who have no rights, and the prudential judgment of attacking a nation that is supporting terrorism. Those are prudential judgments. And as the one of the reasons I spent so much time reading from the national security strategy, because I wanted to foreclose the caricatures that it all often invites. Like, the United States is just going out and like this crusade. That simply is a distortion of the doctrine. That's not what the doctrine is saying. It's much more calibrated than that. Well, anyway, let's just keep it at that. Keep going.
We have time for probably about one more question, so if you have another question for Dr. Cartwright.
I'm going to read a statement following 9/11. This was by the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker House. This is sort of Howard Wassey and pacifism gone to seed. This is the seamless garment.
Dorothy Day lived before Howard Wassey.
Yeah. The statement declared, any bombing, anywhere is a tragedy. Any bloodshed, anywhere is a tragedy. No war is holy. All war is evil. If we kill, that is the U.S., if we kill as a response to this great tragedy, 9/11, we are no better than the terrorists. We are no better than the terrorists who launched this awful offensive. Killing is killing, and killing is wrong. As a pacifist, do you agree or disagree that if we kill in response to 9/11, we are no better than the terrorists?
I would answer in terms of the just war tradition itself. At the end...
No. Answer as a pacifist. You're a pacifist, right?
Do I get to talk?
Yeah. Okay, you get to talk.
Okay.
I'll give you an extra minute of my time for that.
At the end of a war that was regarded as just, the church asked all parties in a war that was regarded as just to engage in acts of repentance for the sin that was committed. It was not assumed that all sins were of the same kind. It was not assumed that all sins were of equal gravity. It was assumed that all participants in a just war required repentance. As a pacifist and as one who takes seriously the just war tradition, I also take seriously that no one in the classic just war tradition has ever said that participation in war was anything less than sin.
Thomas Aquinas. I mean, come on. The question was asked under a section on love. That's just simply false. Historically, that is wrong.
You quoted Aquinas on evil. You didn't quote Aquinas in terms of what constitutes a sinful act or what constitutes a habitus. Aquinas can be read and is read properly as also saying one who participates in a justifiable war is still one who has committed sin. That doesn't mean that one is beyond the pale of God for forgiveness. It doesn't mean that one cannot return to God's grace, but
this is where I would just point out, this is why I gave out the many quotations. You can't reach that conclusion from the quotations of the classic theologians I just gave. The reason the medievals required penance was because the intention, it wasn't the objective act of a political leader who has the obligation under just war theory and just war tradition. A political authority has the obligation to use force to protect the citizens and the common good of his realm. That is an obligation, pointing to Romans 13, right? To punish evil and protect the good in their office as civil authority established by the Lord God himself. You see, what we're getting at here, and in a number of these debates, and you may be picking up on it, but I've been in a number of debates with pacifists who really don't agree with the just war tradition. They think it's immoral, unjust, right? They're really pacifists. And then they establish an understanding of the just war tradition
that is read through pacifist grid. Now, you see, I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding, a warping of the tradition itself. To say, in spite of Thomas's clear response to the question, is it always evil, is it sinful, within the context of a section dealing with love, to say that the civil authority or those soldiers who actually carry that out are necessarily doing wrong. The reason for penance was in the likelihood, often, that even in a good and just cause, that their intentions might have been wrong. Right?
It was specified in canon law in terms of the acts, not just the intentions, so that someone who had wounded someone had a penance of this kind. Someone who had killed someone had a penance of this kind in this way. It was not simply intent, it was actions. Again, there's nothing about the way the just war tradition was applied within the context of the church and its penitential system that presumed that someone could not be forgiven for participation in it. But it did indicate that participation in war does alter you in ways that requires you to take a time out for a while, not as punishment, but as a time for serious soul searching. In the same way, Keith, that I honor those military leaders, those military personnel who take war very, very seriously and loathe war, I also acknowledge those who feel guilt for participation, who seek forgiveness. And the church ought to be about that kind of conversation. What grieves me about the kind of stipulative reasoning that you've engaged in that lops off who can participate is twofold. One, when can we speak truth to power as Christians? It is part of the Christian witness to speak truth to power, whether power is George Bush or Vladimir Putin or Saddam Hussein. When can we speak truth to power?
All the time. And formally when there are elections. Right? I mean, all the time. Are you kidding? There's no lack of criticism. I mean, it's like at 57 channels on television. You can get up,
Keith, when I raise the question
from every political. I mean, there's no lack of criticism of the president or Congress. There's opposition parties. I mean, there's the UN. What are you talking about?
When I raise the question about the Project for a New American Century, and if I went on to read, as you have done, about what Podhoretz has asked for in terms of the long overdue internal reform and modernization of Islam, there clearly is an interest among some who are related to the government of the United States of America to engage in something that is going to be understood as a crusade by Muslims and rightly can be interpreted to be a crusade when crusade rhetoric has been used. The president has not been careful in disassociating himself from crusade rhetoric. He has used holy war language. What I would plead for as a Christian who is a pacifist is clarity about the different logics involved.
I would say that is not wrong. That is not right. He is not engaged in holy war, crusade rhetoric. He's bending over backwards to say that religion, that Islam is a religion of peace, when we all know it means submission.
We're out of time. We're out of time for the cross-examination period. At this point, we want to turn to our rebuttals. You'll both have your opportunity to give a short speech in rebuttal of 4 minutes each. We'll start with Dr. Cartwright, and then we'll go to Dr. Pavlicek.
As more than one historian has observed, Americans prefer to believe that their government only engages in good wars and that they themselves only fight good wars. One of the consequences of this kind of amnesic memory is that we fail to notice the ways in which we think about war not with the restraint of just war criteria, but rather with the righteousness of those who believe that they are engaged in a holy cause. This is dangerous for several reasons, particularly in talking about preemptive war. First, Christians cannot afford the self-deception of ignoring the ways that the power of evil can distract us from what is good and from what we are about in the world as ambassadors for Christ. As John Howard Yoder once observed, the assumption of righteousness may be the most inappropriate assumption to make. Actually, the danger of being one-sided in our moral judgments is increased precisely where power is the greatest and where the capacity for self-criticism is the least, end quote. Again, my concern is if we are the only superpower, then where is the voice of the Christian church in engaging that superpower? The principalities and powers of this age are not simply on the other side of the Atlantic. They are not simply in the Middle East. They are here with us. Second, we ignore the way the Iraqi people and the Arab peoples more generally have heard the militaristic rhetoric of the American nation and its chief executive officer. We prefer not to assign a great deal of significance to President Bush's comments, but once a president has suggested the prospect of using nuclear weapons against one country, it is not unreasonable for another country, Iraq, to perceive the American president as engaging in menacing behavior. I might add that this only exacerbates the problem of Dirty Harry ethics in resolving to use disproportionate means to combat the perceived evil threat. The renegade cop negates the very moral clarity that he seeks. Finally, we have a problem of memory. It is a very important problem to reconcile, to engage, and for Christians to be very careful about. In the United States, we as a culture tend to remember in increments of decades. We think about the 1960s. We think about the 1970s. In Europe, cultural memory has tended to be demarcated in centuries. They think of the epoch of the 18th century. In the Middle East, memory is millennial. And I'm not talking about Tim LaHaye fantasies. I'm talking about the Crusades. In Galilee, my friend Elias Shakur, a Palestinian Christian activist for peace, refers to Jesus as his cousin. In Jerusalem, the Muslim citizens refer to the Crusades as if they happened yesterday. We can actually play into the fantasy world of terrorists when we use rhetoric that gives Muslims the idea that Christians in the West are fighting a crusade. I have heard more and more Christians, laity and clergy alike, talking as if they believe that this war is a clash of civilizations, of a so-called Islamic civilization against a so-called Christian civilization. It is not a holy war that we should be about. We should be about speaking truth to power whenever we can, wherever we can, by God's grace and into God's power. Thank you.
Listen, if this was about Dirty Harry ethics, I would be opposed to the doctrine of preemption as discussed in the National Security Strategy of the United States as well. But this isn't about Dirty Harry. This is about addressing a very real and honest-to-God threat, right? Of suicidal martyrs who are intent, like today, in this country, right? On an attack that would make the attack on the World Trade Center, 3,000 people, would dwarf it. This isn't fantasy. This isn't a lack of imagination. This isn't so-called neoconservative cabal
heading on a crusade into the Middle East. This is a strategy designed to preempt terrorists who are willing to obliterate Chicago. And the only question before us is whether we can deal with classical notions of imminence between two poised nation states, in which imminence is understood as mobilization, which is why people have tried to get this point across in the popular media by saying, what would imminent look like on September 10th? What would it look like? What would it look like? What would a preemptive strike look like on an airplane headed for the capital of the United States? We're not talking about Dirty Harry ethics. And we're not talking about the movie Dirty Harry. If you want to appeal to a movie, maybe we ought to talk about High Noon. How many of you seen High Noon? High Noon. George Bush is Gary Cooper. This isn't a crusade. I would run with that, but I don't have enough time, right? The preemptive strategy was not the doctrine of preemption only came after September 11th as a doctrine, and then it was carefully calibrated. We're about to go to war with Iraq, okay? Now, after everything that's been going through, some people will still say that this is not a last resort, okay? Even though the the decision makers were urged to go to Congress, went to Congress and got the support of the opposition party. They were urged to go to the UN and got a unanimous declaration by the United Nations Security Council. And we all know the details of that. Okay? And now, the only thing preventing the complete irrelevance of the United Nations is a preemptive strike by, preemptive veto by France. Last resort has been met, folks. If this doesn't constitute last resort, there's absolutely no meaning to the term. Okay, thanks.
All right, we're now going to turn to a short time of question and answers. And we have a group of students who have agreed to help us in this part of our debate. Each will be coming up in turn, asking a question to one or both of the speakers and telling you where they come from and how they have been involved in the debate on campus. So, thank you.
My name is David Yaley. I'm a member of the Plowshares group, which is our pacifist group on campus. And my question is for Dr. Pavlicek. On the just war criteria that Dr. Cartwright gave us, number 3 says the ultimate goal must be peace. Now, come 8 o'clock Monday of this week, George Bush gives his 48-hour ultimatum to Saddam Hussein, and right after that, we have Ashcroft raising the level of terror to yellow, to the second highest level. And so what I'm wondering is, what is this the self-perpetuating logic, I think, that we're getting involved in? I mean, the very thing we're trying to fight, terrorism, is the very thing that we become more acutely aware of and more susceptible to, what's the word?
Susceptible.
Yeah, to. So do you see what I'm saying? So I'm wondering how you balanced number 3 with the very thing we're fighting, and yet at the same time we're perpetuating it.
The peace, as Augustine understood it,
and the peace sought by political authorities when they use force more generally is not the peace of the new heavens and new earth. It's not the peace of the eschaton.
You need to move your mic.
Oh, can you all hear me? No. Oh, okay. Let's just said something. The peace, I was saying, sought, the intention of peace is not the peace of the new heavens and the new earth. It's not an eschatological peace. It's not a utopian peace. It's what St. Augustine called the tranquility of order, or the peace of order, right? It truly would be. I mean, in fact, it's a characteristic of militarism as it expresses itself in various forms of totalitarianism, whether fascism or Marxist-Leninist ideology, communist ideology, that it seeks a utopian peace. The just war tradition realizes too deep an understanding of nature of human sin and the fallenness of humanity to seek that kind of a peace. So it's a tranquility of order. And secondly, I didn't understand the second part of your question. People said that if Al Qaeda says that if you do this, we're going to strike innocents, we're going to attack, or if you have other indications and warning, you raise the threat level. I don't understand the other points of the comment.
Well, I think part of what the question is, if we're saying that we're trying to reduce the danger, and then as soon as the president says you have 48 hours, our intelligence suggests that now the threat to innocent lives here is higher, how are you reducing the threat to innocent lives?
Oh, well, you have to look in terms of of a little longer time frame than 1 week or 1 month or 2 months, and that the Homeland Security colored chart is designed to be pegged to indications and warnings that you get from intelligence. I mean, the alternative is to do nothing. And of course, as a pacifist, this is it's not simply that you oppose preemption, you also opposed the use of lethal force for a lower doctrine of deterrence as well. You see, I mean, which is, is the claim that if we didn't have preemption, that, a better strategy would be one of deterrence, using military force? Is that what you're advocating? Would that raise or lower the threat? I don't know.
Next question.
My name is Will Sleeth, and I'm here from the College Republicans. My question is for Dr. Cartwright. If you rail against, I have a question for you, then a follow-up, depending upon your answer. If you rail against preemptive war, is it correct that you would also have to oppose preemptive wars of humanitarian intervention, for example, in Rwanda, Bosnia, Somalia, Kosovo, and East Timor?
Would you repeat the question, please?
If you oppose preemptive war, which it seems clear that you do, is it correct that you would also have to oppose preemptive wars of humanitarian intervention, for example, in Kosovo or Somalia and the like?
Yes, but.
Yes, you would? Okay.
But I think we shouldn't ignore the possibilities of groups like Christian peacemaker teams, groups like the International Solidarity Movement that go and get in the way and that are willing to give their lives. I know a young woman named Leah Wilson who's in Baghdad tonight as an evangelical Christian getting in the way. I know of a Mennonite man named Al Meyer who is in Hebron getting in the way. There are ways to intervene. I would never claim to know some kind of science or art by which you could claim to know how to intervene in all situations all the time with 100% effectiveness, but we shouldn't underestimate the possibility of being effective some of the time by intervening with nonviolent means. So, yes, but.
Okay, my follow-up is then, recognizing that this sort of preemptive war is illegitimate, and also recognizing that the United States has engaged in such a type of war under the Clinton administration, how much then can you attribute, I guess, the supposed Dirty Harry ethos to the Bush administration when it wasn't, in fact, the Clinton administration representing a completely different strain of political ideology which first engaged us in this war? I guess what I'm saying is Clinton represented the American left, which flunks your preemption test, and Bush represents the American right, which also flunks your preemption test. How does the fact that both strains of ideology of the political spectrum have failed your preemption test, how do you see the future of your beliefs in America, since it seems that both ideologies have rejected it?
Look, I didn't have to go 4 years to college to learn that if you're a Christian pacifist, you're in the minority. I'm not a Democrat. I am not a Republican. I take exception to the misdeeds of the Clinton administration as much as anyone would want to take exception to them. And I don't think Al Gore or Bill Clinton would have much more moral wisdom to offer on this either. So to me, it's a moot point. As a pacifist, I am in the minority.
Can I answer that?
Briefly.
I debated.
Is there a question you don't want to answer?
Well, but I think this is important. I debated conservative Republicans over Kosovo all over the place in Washington. I supported President Clinton on Kosovo. And I criticized the Republicans when they said in 1998, during Operation Desert Fox, that this was a wag the dog scenario. It wasn't. And Kosovo was a just intervention. And it saved people from genocide. It saved Muslims from genocide. And Muslims were asking, what took you so long? Okay.
Next question.
My name's Sarah Pavelko. I'm editor on the New Independent News. I'm on the editorial board of the New Independent newspaper Clarion, and I've been in charge of the partial fast praying for wisdom and discernment and peace in the Iraq conflict. My question is for either one, if you want to answer. A little bit more, though, directed towards Dr. Pavlicek. Last resort is one criteria used to justify the use of force, and you spoke of it in terms of authority, and I have always viewed it as more speaking towards a group of prior actions leading up to the use of force. In light of certain actions over the last 10 years, with the CIA being in the, or U.S. intelligence being in the Iraqi inspection teams, lack of meetings between upper administration in the U.S. and upper-level officials in the Iraqi regime, and public degradation of Saddam, which has been continued from Clinton over to Bush, who has not addressed these problems in past diplomacy issues. Is it possible to morally justify the use of force in preemption with seemingly more ambiguous diplomatic means, and could this continue the trend of belittling the role and evaluation of actions prior to an eruption of conflict? In my opinion, it is extremely crucial to emphasize prior prudence, nonviolent action, and moral evaluation of foreign policy, not just right when conflict erupts.
I agree with your final comments. I should say that the support that the UN inspectors received from U.S. intelligence as well, and in the earlier inspections regime, was requested. I mean, that's why U-2 flights are flying over Iraq the last 3 weeks, because they requested them. They wanted our intelligence to support them. Some people are criticizing U.S. intelligence because we're not giving them everything of late. But yeah, I mean, I think you have to evaluate all foreign policy, which gets to the broader point that the just war tradition is an aspect of the Christian understanding of statecraft, Christian responsibility in political authority, as particularly applied to the use of force. So, of course, that's why you have a great professor of international relations here, Mark Amstutz. Mark, you out there?
I would have two comments to make. I spoke earlier about being an ambassador for Jesus Christ. We are called to be diplomats. People who advocate nonviolence must become adept at using ways of reasoning to help people that is always also morally ambiguous. It's not a matter of purism. It's a matter of engaging in the kinds of conversations where you can, when you can, to help forestall war. So that's the first thing, but I would urge you to think of the just war tradition as not simply statecraft, but churchcraft. We need in the church to be having conversations that are not about equivocation about war, but are about serious questions of prudence, of when and where and how. And that is one of the failures of the church in America today. We have not had the conversations, and so we find ourselves poorly equipped to engage the issues.
Next question.
My name is Judd Birdsall, and I'm with the College Republicans and the school newspaper, though I'm not an official representative of either. My question is for Dr. Pavlicek. You base your argument for preemption on the just war theory. However, what do we make of the sharp disagreements among various just war theorists? On one hand, we have George Weigel saying that preemption against Iraq is both morally justified and imperative, and then we have the Pope speaking out against the war. So how do we decide who is right?
Great question. Super question. We should have started with that question. Because in fact what we have going on here is you've got pacifism and you've got two rival versions of just war theory. Okay. To get to the specifics of your question, one reason you could disagree is that you could come to reasonable Christians, without being duplicitous, can honestly come to different prudential judgments, right, in terms of the medium long-term effects, questions of proportionality, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just always going to be the case, okay? But there's something more fundamental than that, and it gets back to what I said about what I think is the warping of the tradition. Ever since the Catholic bishops, the Challenge of Peace statement, they tried to find a synthesis between two incompatible Christian understandings of pacifism and just war. I think the resulting hybrid is a historical and theoretical mess. I think it's awful. The claim that historically and conceptually, as the bishop said in '82, that the just war tradition begins and ends with a presumption against war, which they got from a secular, which they got from Childress, a philosopher who claimed that the just war tradition embodied a prima facie rejection of the use of force, is fundamentally mistaken. It's fundamentally mistaken. And I think what reason I gave you the green sheet is to try to demonstrate how that is simply not the case. George Weigel and James Turner Johnson, who's the best on this, I think he was here not too long ago, myself, and even Brian Hare admits now, who wrote the Challenge of Peace, admits that historically Jim Johnson is absolutely right? But then they say, well, so much the worse for the tradition, we have to, we're in a new era now, okay? I think it does not begin with the presumption against force. It begins with the obligation of civil authorities before God, right, to wield the sword in protection of the innocent. It begins not with a presumption against force, but with a presumption against injustice, right? Okay. Killing innocents at the World Trade Center is unjust, okay?
All right, and Dr. Cartwright, has a quick response as well.
As a tradition of moral wisdom, the just war theory has many voices in it. They will disagree. Different councils of prudence will disagree. As Keith has indicated, there is a Westphalian school. There are people who are moving away from the Westphalian school. There are people who believe that you can innovate within the tradition, and there are people who are treating the tradition as if it is defined and nothing can be done with it. It's always going to be an ongoing argument about goods internal to practice. It needs to be an argument in which many voices are participating and not an argument confined to the few.
All right, we have time for one last very quick question.
My name is Ryan Schiffer. I'm also with the Plowshares Club here on campus. And I guess my question can be open-ended to either one of you. It has to do with the discussion about laity in terms of George Bush and Condoleezza Rice and how we as Christians should respond to them. How do you feel about Tariq Aziz, the equivalent of the vice president of Hussein, being a Christian? What is the role of the Iraqi people in responding to him? Also, as a fellow Christian, is it the same as Condoleezza Rice and Bush? Is there?
The question is,
Well, as we talk about the fact that we talk about our fellow believers, the President, Condi Rice, and others, so there are Christians in Iraq, including Tariq Aziz. How do we respond to him?
what's his argument? I mean, his argument is that the Iraqi regime is a just regime.
He's just asking.
But I think the question assumes, it seems to be predicated on a moral symmetry between regimes.
Just inquiring.
Well, but what he's aiming at is, well, gee, I mean, the foreign minister of a regime headed by a genocidal maniac, okay, he's a Christian. What about Condoleezza Rice and George Bush? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to make.
Let's.
I don't think it's a legitimate question. No, I don't respect the views of Tariq Aziz. I don't care if he's a Christian or not. I mean, what's that have to do with it? He's part of a genocidal, maniac, terrorist regime. There's a difference.
I don't think someone being a Christian or non-Christian as a part of a regime necessarily changes the matter in any way. I do think that Constantine wanted to be a Christian, but I think Constantine struggled with how to be a Christian and being an emperor. And anytime you have power, whether as a bureaucrat with a collar on, I didn't wear my collar tonight, I should have. Anytime you're dealing with power, you're tempted to think more of your own instrumentality before God than you ought to. God can use anything and anyone. God used Cyrus of Persia. God could use George Bush. And God could use Saddam Hussein because God is God. And God has the power to engage the principalities and powers of this world. And God has called us to speak truth to them.
All right, I think that concludes the time that we have for questions and answers. Let's thank both of our participants very much for engaging the debate.
Thank you, Dr. Black and Dr. Pavlicek and Dr. Cartwright. We're grateful for your time and your willingness and your efforts with us this evening. I'd also like to thank the Penner family for their generous support and time and commitment to this evening. Congratulations, Penners, we got through a debate without national disaster. However, we have received word that just about 20 minutes ago, a United States cruise missile strike occurred in Baghdad. They have received anti-aircraft fire from ground forces in Iraq. And apparently the strike was on a target of opportunity. President Bush is scheduled to address our nation at 9:15 our time. You're welcome to stay because some of you have travel time and you might not want to miss the speech. We will open the curtains and we will show CNN on the screen. You're welcome to use this place to observe the President's speech. Before we adjourn, may I close us in prayer, please? Father, may your peace be the hope and the fulfillment of all people. And may we be your ambassadors for that peace. And Father, will your mercy be upon us in war. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. You're dismissed.